In 1922, a small book was published, written by a philosopher over the years he served in the First World War. This book quickly gained popularity over the preceding years, and would become a cornerstone for 20th century philosophy. But the philosopher of this book shunned any interest in himself or his work. He had said everything that needed to be said. He had solved the problems in philosophy in less than 100 pages, and saw no need to elaborate further. He had instead retreated to the remotest of villages to teach children mathematics. However, the popularity of his work only continued to increase, and with it, a string of philosophers who were misinterpreting his work, causing more problems that the philosopher had claimed to have solved. It would seem that this philosopher had unfinished business, and would once again need to return to the philosophical world. The philosopher was Ludwig Wittgenstein, and this is one of philosophy's greatest stories. Ludwig Wittgenstein was born in Vienna in 1889 into one of the wealthiest families in Europe and the youngest of 9 children. His father, Karl Wittgenstein, a successful businessman who dealt in steel, prepared his children, particularly his sons, to likewise become successes in different fields. Wittgenstein's brother Paul became a famous pianist despite the fact he had an arm amputated in the First World War, and became a prodigy as a left-handed pianist. Of the other Wittgenstein sons, unfortunately, 2 of them died by suicide, and the remaining one was probable suicide. Karl's harsh upbringing to prepare his sons for success similar to his own may have contributed to the immense pressure on his sons, but there are a multitude of reasons to their suicides which we shall not go into here. Ludwig Wittgenstein himself had, in his early years after school, remained directionless with regards to his career. He began studying engineering, moving to Manchester to study aeronautics, and conducting research on flight engines and investigating the upper atmosphere using kites. While his success was marginal due to a lack of formal training in mechanics, he began to become much more interested in the theory and mathematics that lay behind the mechanics. He visited philosopher and mathematician Gottlob Frege, which gave him new purpose and also directed him to go see another philosopher and mathematician, Bertrand Russell, at Cambridge University. There, Wittgenstein would develop much of his early ideas that would go into one of the most influential philosophical texts of the 20th century. Wittgenstein's studies at Cambridge were interrupted with the outbreak of the First World War. He saw some action in some of the fiercest fighting over the course of the war, even being awarded numerous medals for his service. His experiences during the war had left him scarred, and he developed a much more mystic approach to life, turning to religion to confront what he perceived as his own weaknesses. Wittgenstein, raised as a Catholic, had no interest in organised religion, but still appropriated the attitude of Catholicism with regards to confronting one's corruption in a private affair, via confession, etc. But again, he had no interest in the practices and ceremonies of the church. During the war, he had turned towards writers and philosophers such as Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, and Kierkegaard to help him confront the horrors of existence that he had seen, and also inside of himself. During some military leave in 1918, he finally finished the book in which he would answer all the problems of philosophy, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, typically shortened to the Tractatus. A fairly short book by philosophical standards, it nevertheless said everything that Wittgenstein wanted to say about philosophy. Wittgenstein was well known for his intolerance of nonsense. He would not do anything or get involved in something unless he was able to be completely involved and direct, without any erring or double-mindedness. The fact that he struggled to do this, as any human would, weighed very heavily on him, and perhaps why he never published anything again. Let us briefly go over the argument that Wittgenstein makes in the Tractatus. It is structured as a series of propositions, in the mathematical analytic tradition of Russell and Frege, and addresses the classic problems of philosophy as logical propositions that combine and proceed from one another to form a complete system. While Wittgenstein does utilise mathematical propositions and symbols later on in the book, we should be able to, as Wittgenstein would intend, grasp the argument without an understanding of certain mathematical symbols and structures. Firstly, Proposition 1 states that the world is all that is the case. The world is all that we should be speaking about. The next proposition, 1.1, the world is the totality of facts, not things. This means that philosophy deals with those statements that are about and refer to the world. Philosophy does not refer to objects or things, they are completely different. 1.12, for the totality of the facts determine what is the case, and also whatever is not the case. If we have all the facts about the world, we can know what applies to the world and what doesn't. 1.13, the facts in logical space are the world. Again, facts that connect to one another logically make up the world in which we inhabit and which we refer to. With these definitions of facts and the world, we can move on to the second set of propositions. 2. What is the case? A fact is the existence of a state of affairs. So what we previously understood as a fact can be further defined as being a state of affairs that exist in the world. 2.01. A state of affairs, a state of things, is a combination of objects, things. The combination of state of affairs that exist make up the world. Objects are independent, simple structures that cannot be broken down into more simple substances. Likewise, objects cannot be combined to make other objects. These objects are what we would typically call metaphysical. They exist outside or independent of our philosophical investigations. Objects are not what make up the world, as stated in Proposition 1.1. They are beyond it, and our world consists only of facts. Basically, our philosophy does not alter the form of the world. If we could add and remove objects from the world, our philosophy could end up referring to things which do not exist. The foundations of our philosophy must not be alterable, if it is to make sense. What does change is the configuration of these objects in state of affairs. Using our facts, we can construct pictures of the world, outlined in the third set of propositions. These pictures, built solely with our facts, refer to the world as it is. The picture must, in some way, mirror the fact in its logic. We may change the language we use to build our picture, but we may not alter its logic. Otherwise, the picture ceases to refer to the facts and becomes nonsense. The fourth set of propositions define the task of philosophy, and where philosophy has previously gone wrong in trying to establish things beyond its boundary or ability. Philosophy is not a doctrine, but an activity, Wittgenstein writes in Proposition 4.112. Philosophy does not result in philosophical propositions, but rather in the clarification of propositions. Without philosophy, thoughts are, as it were, cloudy and indistinct. Its task is to make them clear and give them sharp boundaries. Philosophy does not add anything to the world per se. Its propositions do not reveal to us the truth or the nature of the world. Philosophy does not carve out a road to truth, but it can point us in the right direction if we get lost. If a picture is confusing and we do not know what it refers to, philosophy is used to show where that picture has gone wrong. The subjects of traditional philosophy Wittgenstein paints as nonsense. They refer to things that cannot be referred to, that, if they do exist, do so outside of our world made of facts. Philosophy offers us a way to clearly see the limit of what is sense and what is nonsense. Philosophy as an activity, as stated in 4.112, means it must be shown rather than said. Here we must take the leap out of our propositions and actually enact or show what we know. Wittgenstein uses truth tables as the showing of his point, but it's not necessary to go over them here. The important thing to understand at this point is that language, in which we are doing our philosophy, cannot refer outside of itself to solve those problems outside of itself. An example may be how we can do maths using the mathematical language of numbers and symbols, but if we wish to discuss this thing called mathematics, we can't do that using the very numbers and symbols we do it with. We leave the propositions of mathematics behind to get to its sense, what it is as an activity, and so forth. Philosophy can only refer to itself. If I were to express the statement, "It is raining today," what this proposition is actually saying is, this proposition states it is raining today. It never goes beyond itself. Philosophy allows us to formulate a statement about the state of the weather on this day, but the event to which it refers must be shown. This is why that Wittgenstein states, if you reach this far into the Tractatus, you will realise that everything it has said is senseless and should be discarded, like a ladder when you have climbed it to a new height, borrowing a phrase from the philosopher Schopenhauer, who was one of the first philosophers that Wittgenstein read. The task of clearly separating what is sense and what is nonsense, or nonsense, is the task of philosophy. But there are those things that philosophy cannot speak about at all, and Wittgenstein refers to these as the mystical. These are the things that philosophy has gotten itself into all its trouble over the years trying to understand and explain, when it should have known to leave them alone. God, death, ethics, the afterlife, these are things that philosophy cannot solve. They are, nevertheless, perhaps the most important things about our existence and what it means to be alive. Again, this is why, at this point, we throw away our propositions, since they only serve to alienate us from the mystical and confuse us, as they have done to so many philosophers before. Wittgenstein ends with Proposition 7, which succinctly states, "What we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence." These things we must remain silent about may be the most important things in life that we have mentioned, but we reserve them for silence, as any attempt to speak of them forces them into a language which cannot possibly express them clearly. The Tractatus can be summed up simply, as Bertrand Russell did in his foreword, partly echoing Wittgenstein's final proposition as, "What can be said at all can be said clearly, and what we cannot talk about, we must pass over in silence." As far as Wittgenstein was concerned, he had solved all of philosophy's problems by defining clearly what was the work of philosophy and what it should do, and what was not, and what it should leave alone. Despite Wittgenstein's declaration that he had solved all problems of philosophy in less than 100 pages, publishing his work would prove to be a significant challenge. The first publisher he went to refused it, and shortly after, Wittgenstein, as a soldier fighting in the First World War, was sent to one of the bloodiest parts of the conflict on the Italian front, and was also captured and remained a prisoner of war for 9 months until the war ended. Eventually, Wittgenstein managed to get the Tractatus published, with the help of Bertrand Russell writing the foreword. By this time, Wittgenstein was a changed man, according to Russell and others that knew him. The war, and everything he had seen and experienced, had led him to turn to, in his words in the Tractatus, the mystical, that which we must pass over in silence. He had become known among other troops as the strange man who carried around a copy of Dostoevsky's The Gospel in Brief, compelling them to read it. Again, Wittgenstein was not a religious man. He was Jewish, but raised a Catholic like his father, but he found something profound in the attitude of Catholicism, of answering to oneself for one's sins and actions. Answering with philosophy seemed to be pointless in this exercise. If an individual lets rules of philosophy answer for them, then they themselves are not confronting it. Similarly, leaning on organised religion to provide a path for you was also complete nonsense for Wittgenstein. Slowly, the Tractatus began to gain popularity in philosophical circles, and subsequently, the popularity of this philosopher, who had seemingly come out of nowhere to address the fundamental problems of the discipline. In particular, the logical positivists of the Vienna Circle, based at the university in the city of Wittgenstein's birth, were obsessed with the Tractatus and spent their famous seminars poring over each and every proposition in the book. The logical positivists based their philosophy on building a philosophical system that was built on solid, logical positions, and that any statement could be calculated as true or false based on the operations of their system. They have their origins in the work of Ernst Mach, the chair of the University of Vienna at the beginning of the 20th century, and while most famous for his discovery of Mach speed, so named after him, he also held the belief that science should only deal with the things we can sense, famously dismissing the study of atoms as nonsense, because we cannot sense or experience them individually. The logical positivists, similarly, tried to define the foundations of their system, and anything that could not be constructed from the propositions of said system would be irrelevant. The Vienna Circle quite often resembled the Wittgenstein fan club, as they would spend hours analysing a single proposition from the Tractatus. But Wittgenstein wanted nothing to do with them, and would rarely answer letters or invitations from them. This is because they, for Wittgenstein, completely overlooked the most important part of the Tractatus, that of the mystical. The most important aspects of being and existence were being completely dismissed by their work, that the passing over in silence became for them a quick dismissal, instead of trying to build lofty philosophical structures that would never deal with anything important. Wittgenstein remained an acquaintanceship with one of the circle, Rudolf Carnap, but apparently this was cut off when Wittgenstein was browsing Carnap's library one day and found a book on spiritualism. We can probably conclude that spiritualism was for Wittgenstein another attempt to study that which should be passed over in silence, and in doing so, misrepresent and cheapen its significance. Wittgenstein took no attempt to capitalise on his rising popularity. He had said all that he needed to say, and was content to pass over in silence the things he didn't. To this end, he had retreated to isolated villages to teach children mathematics. Even with a significant inheritance received from the death of his father, Wittgenstein lived in barely furnished rooms with only a wooden chair, table, and bed, choosing to give away a portion of his inheritance to artists. Wittgenstein didn't seem to really enjoy doing this teaching, and likewise despised the people he was surrounded by, although he had the same feelings for the high society of Cambridge too. Wittgenstein would devote extra time to the students that were invested in what he had to say, but would strictly admonish those children who could not get what he was teaching, often delivering corporal punishment, as was quite common at the time. The most famous incident of this was the so-called Heidelberg incident, named after the village where Wittgenstein was teaching at the time, where he apparently hit a child so hard they were rendered unconscious. He quit the role a week later and never taught children again. Perhaps this time as a teacher taught Wittgenstein something, that since even young children could not follow his clear instructions regarding mathematics and logic, that perhaps he was wrong about having finished the problem of philosophy. To that end, he retreated to the wilderness in Norway, where he spent 1936 to 1937 writing notes that were posthumously published as the Philosophical Investigations. But perhaps there was another reason that forced Wittgenstein back into philosophical circles. The shadow of war was once again looming over Europe, and following Germany's annexation of Wittgenstein's homeland Austria in 1938, he would have been subject to the Nuremberg racial laws, and would have been forced to register as a Jew because 3 of his 4 grandparents were Jewish, and also as a German citizen. His brother Paul had already been charged with racial defilement, having married a non-Jew, and already fled to the United States. Wittgenstein was on holiday in Ireland at the time, and began to investigate British or Irish citizenship. Wittgenstein and his siblings had been given the extremely rare exception to the racial laws by the leader of Germany himself, thanks in part to Ludwig's sister Gretel, who negotiated with the government with the family's obscene fortune to reclassify one of their grandparents as non-Jewish. Wittgenstein was allowed to travel to Vienna thanks to this exception, but he and his family dared not stay there again. In 1939, Wittgenstein returned to Cambridge and took the chair in philosophy there, recently vacated by G.E. Moore. He was also granted British citizenship after his friends expedited the process before any war broke out. Now he was back where he was 20 years before, but with a completely different outlook. Wittgenstein's teachings at Cambridge at this time were the complete opposite of what he had dealt in before he left there at the outset of the First World War. Back then, he believed logic could provide a foundation for all of mathematics, following in the footsteps of Frege and Russell. Now, his thoughts were quite the opposite, and it is here we shall outline the thoughts of what is termed as the later Wittgenstein. Instead of language being based on a foundation that decides whether a sentence or position is sense or nonsense, Wittgenstein now believed that language had absolutely no foundation at all. Language only made sense within the language games in which it is used. We can think of the language games as a kind of context that has rules and operations, but we cannot simply look for them underneath the language as its foundations. The more we try to analyse the language we use and look for its meaning, the further we slip away from it. For example, if I am to state the proposition, "I am in pain," a doctor may ask, "Where is the pain?" To which I may show it by pointing to a specific region of my body, or explaining what type of pain it is, be it recurring, short and sharp, and so on. I cannot take the pain out of my body and show it to the doctor. To do so is to misrepresent it. Also, if I try, as a philosopher, to understand what I mean by a sharp pain, for example, I begin to take the words away from their context or language game and interrogate what they mean. But without that language game, the words relate to nothing and are essentially nonsense. Likewise, a doctor prescribes a course of treatment through what a patient shows them. They do not necessarily need to interrogate the specifics of a word, only how that word relates to the rules of the game in which it is used. Essentially, the more philosophy interrogates single things, the more it isolates them from their surroundings, rules, and context that actually give it meaning. Nowhere is Wittgenstein's philosophical thought more pronounced than when he turns it towards mathematics. In the Tractatus, logic provides a means by which to construct a state of affairs or a picture of the world. Even if, at the end of the book, he says that the limits of language mean it cannot actually present the truth or reality, language may say something about reality, but reality consists in showing, and that is something language cannot do. Upon Wittgenstein's return to philosophy, he abandoned even this pretense of mathematics being able to construct a picture of reality. No longer did he see mathematics as even having the ability to generate an accurate picture of the world. It was just another language game. His lectures at Cambridge, recorded in the notes of his students in the book Lectures on the Foundations of Mathematics, show a Wittgenstein focused on dismantling what he had previously supposed. Essentially, he says that there are no new mathematical discoveries to be made, and, as a philosopher, he is only concerned with how the language of mathematics is used, and how it can become confused with our everyday use of these words. Terms such as series, proof, order, imaginary numbers raise certain assumptions about our ordinary use of them that can confuse their use in mathematics. No longer is mathematics a foundational language. It is just one language amongst many. Any hierarchy of language is done away with in this period of Wittgenstein's philosophy, and as a consequence of this, is language games exist laterally, side by side with one another, and this leads to these language games having overlapping terms and meanings that can become confusing, such as when a mathematical term that has a different meaning in our ordinary use of it. Wittgenstein's lectures consisted in him primarily warning his students when their analysis of mathematics strays too far from mathematics itself. Among those students is a young Alan Turing, with whom Wittgenstein has more than one heated debate. Just as Wittgenstein had returned to Cambridge, another war in Europe was about to break out, and once again Wittgenstein was teaching philosophy, a job which he dismissed as pointless at the best of times, but saw as outrageous and ludicrous to be doing during wartime. Almost immediately after the war began, he volunteered to help at a hospital, just as he had immediately signed up to the army as soon as the First World War began, trying to find some meaning in being in the middle of human suffering, which he could not get from merely practicing philosophy. After the war had ended, he barely returned to writing philosophy. Retiring from the chair of philosophy in 1947, he wrote various fragments before dying of cancer in 1951. Wittgenstein's legacy is as one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century, changing the landscape of analytic philosophy and the study of language. Despite this, it shouldn't be overstated just how much he seemed to loathe philosophy and how little value it had, evidenced by his rushing to fight on the front lines of a war and facing certain death rather than give a lecture, and often urging his students not to become philosophers. While his early and later work differ in their approach, they find common ground in drawing attention to the limits of philosophy and the importance of what lies beyond those limits. The early Wittgenstein saw mathematics as a foundational language, which could be used to accurately construct pictures of the world if used properly, although it could not show anything about reality. The later Wittgenstein abandoned any notion of a foundational language, saying that mathematics was instead just one language game amongst every other. What the two share is an awareness of the limits of language and philosophy, and those things which give life meaning and value simply lie beyond its reach. The practicing of philosophy does not lead us towards the infinite, the eternal, or the unmoving truth, but actually abstracts our thoughts to a place of nonsense from which nothing worthwhile can be attained. Philosophy instead, according to Wittgenstein, must stop these thoughts, which lead us beyond the limits to where our words make sense. Philosophy must return us to ourselves when our thoughts lead us astray, and to leave alone that which it cannot speak of. With this in mind, it is perhaps best to end on one of the final sentences of the Tractatus. If we take eternity to mean not infinite temporal duration, but timelessness, then eternal life belongs to those who live in the present.